bitches. I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Grinosaur and at Mort_post for official announcements. Hello lovelies. Today I'm going to try and explain the current controversies and churn in British politics, the peculiarities of British politics, and basically why isn't Boris Johnson out yet? If you've been paying attention to international news from your point of view, you may be aware that we've had a Partygate scandal. What this amounts to is that while the government had all of us on lockdown, quite rightly, to control the spread of the disease, Conservative politicians, including the Prime Minister, were having parties and other events and things which were explicitly against the rules that they created and which they enforced on the rest of the country and which the rest of us were following, which is taking the piss. And if there's one thing that an otherwise complacent British populace can't stand, it's when you take the piss. This was pretty serious, right? The Queen's husband, Prince Philip, died during this, and they had a party the night before. The Queen followed the rules. Now, to me, that doesn't mean shit, being a small R Republican, but to Conservative voters, and presumably to a lot of Conservative elder statesmen and so on as well, that is a big deal. You know, people weren't able to be there for their loved ones as they died. I wasn't able to be there with my cat, Charlie, when he died, which is small potatoes compared to what a lot of other people have been through, but, you know, it still hurts. And this was combined with their general incompetence around COVID, in that they were sluggish and late in imposing restrictions and engaging in various things to try and control the spread, including these. So their incompetence has also directly affected me in that my operation that I'm waiting for has been delayed twice. So it's a combination of total incompetence and unwillingness to do what was necessary to control the infection, and also at the same time when they did do something, they didn't follow the rules, and the British public did, and the royal family did, but they didn't. Now, this general problem, this Partygate scandal, this is the crux of it, but this is also compounded by the fact that Brexit has been a predictably, completely unmitigated disaster, and has compounded with infection issues and the Ukraine issues and other issues around import, export and so on, to make things even worse in this country. So all of those economic problems and shipping problems that everyone else in the world is suffering from, we have even worse. Then there's been a tax avoidance scandal that has affected the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person who is in charge of the finances of the country. Turns out him and his wife have been tax dodging this whole time, legally, but even so, ethically, it's not a good thing for someone in charge of the public finances to be doing, to be avoiding paying their fair share and hiding money here and there, and presumably helping his mates do that. Just recently, we have yet another scandal showing the xenophobia of the Conservative Party at a time when everyone's finally swung around to being a bit more pro-refugee and pro-asylum seeker, again, due to what's going on in the Ukraine. This party, Priti Patel, the Conservative Party, they have decided that they're going to ship asylum seekers to Rwanda to be processed, because, you know, holding your refugees and so on offshore worked out so well for Australia recently. Going back to the Chancellor again, he hiked taxes for the poor, not so much for the wealthy, which has been compounding the inflation issue for the poor in this country and pushing people into poverty. And rather than helping people with their extortionate heating bills, they're basically forcibly being given a loan that they then have to pay back, and the loan isn't enough to really help at all either. Speaking of the Ukraine, as we were earlier, and that's relation to the fuel prices and so on, of gas, etc., the UK government hasn't really been doing much to help with Ukrainian refugees. Countries that have previously been extremely hostile to refugees, like Poland and Hungary, those have been helping people. The public mood has definitely shifted to being a bit more pro-refugee since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we've barely taken in anybody compared to other countries which have traditionally been seen as being, not exactly pro-refugee. We have schemes set up where you can pair up with a fleeing family and have them live in your house for a while, but there's so many bureaucratic loopholes and issues to jump through to make this happen that a lot of people can't make it happen. Oh, and they just unveiled a makeover for Big Ben. I know it's not actually called that, but that's what everyone knows it as. We've gold-plated a clock while people are sinking into abject poverty. That's a good thing to do. So how the fuck, in the face of all of this disaster, but most especially the Partygate scandal, because the rest of it, for some reason people don't care so much about that, but in the face of all that, why isn't Boris gone? Well, there's no successor. That's part of the problem, and the Conservative Party don't want to get rid of Boris until they can use him as a scapegoat, really. And they also need to wait for there to be someone who can step into his shoes and take over successfully. And there isn't anyone. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, he was looking like a promising, almost inevitable successor to Boris Johnson. This is something that quite often happens, Chancellors moving in and taking over, because during COVID he'd actually doled out a lot of money, something that Conservatives don't normally do, and so people had a pretty positive view of him. He's quite savvy on social media, fairly photogenic, all the rest of that. But the tax avoidance scandal and his own embroilment in the Partygate scandal means that he's gone from clear favourite to succeed Boris Johnson to flatlining his popularity. And there's no one else really poised to take over either. So many people are tarnished by this Partygate scandal or some of the other things that have been going on. There's no one to take his place. So if they got rid of Boris, they would be crippling themselves, because whatever his sins, Boris is still popular with a certain sector of the British public, and it won't do to get rid of him until they absolutely have to, and they can heap blame upon him for something. The Ukraine is the invasion in the Ukraine is seen as an excuse for not getting rid of Boris. Oh, we shouldn't change leaders in a time of crisis. Historically, that's bollocks. We've often changed leader in times of crisis, whether it be the poll tax riots doing for Margaret Thatcher, or Neville Chamberlain in World War II, or you can go back and back and back. But that's an excuse, and it's one that people will believe. It's also an issue because of how leaders are chosen in our system. Parties choose their leaders. We don't vote for a leader, we vote for a party. Someone might vote for a party because of the leader, but we don't get any direct say. Only the people in their constituency voting for them just as an MP, or the rest of us nationally voting for that party, that's how you get a say. So the only way to get rid of Boris would really be, as a voter, would be for his constituency to vote him out, which isn't likely to happen, or for the country as a whole to vote the Conservatives out, which is possible but not particularly likely, because all of our seats are heavily gerrymandered favouring the Conservatives, because the party in power gets to choose when the election happens, and they're unlikely to choose a time that is disadvantageous for them. This bias is in favour of the Conservatives again, and for whatever party happens to be in power at the time. So that's a big issue. Most people have party loyalty. Something like 75% of people always vote for the same party, regardless. Things might be getting a little bit more flexible as the older generation dies off and the younger generation ages up. They seem to be more likely to vote around, to shop around for who they want to vote for. But most people just vote tribally, unfortunately, that's an issue with democracies everywhere. Brexit diehards refuse to acknowledge that Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster, and Boris is their man. So there's a certain hardcore of people that are never going to abandon Boris and are never going to abandon the populist far-right sort of cant that the Conservatives have taken of late. Same with Covidiots. I mean, they're not that happy with the government, but they're more happy with the government than the opposition. Xenophobia has risen. There's a lot of blame game. Again, like I say, most other countries have opened up to Ukrainians. We haven't, but that doesn't seem to have cost our government locally quite as much as perhaps it might, as you might expect anyway. And yeah, in times of economic hardship, quite often governments will play the blame game. They will blame foreigners, they will blame asylum seekers, they will blame refugees and so on, and that does seem to be happening here. Our laws have been changed to crack down on protest. Not that protest does a great deal, but you know, it's something. But to counter Extinction Rebellion and other environmental protests, the government's passed rafts of legislation, or is in the process of passing rafts of legislation that would essentially outlaw any form of effective protest. Personally, I don't think protest has been effective for about 10 years or so anyway, but you never know. But yeah, that's out the window. And yeah, our first past the post system doesn't work. I mean, even without the gerrymandering and so on, you end up with unrepresentative governments. Our government has a minority of support from the British people. As long as I can remember, no government, even the popular Labour government of 97 as was, I don't think they had a majority of support. Parties just tend to end up with a minority of support. So any government that we have in the UK is not really representative of the democratic will of the people in any way, shape or form. So these things all contribute to Boris staying, really, and I think the primary one is that there's just no one to take over. So they're going to hold on to him for as long as they can until it becomes completely untenable to hold on to him any longer. Then they can get rid of him, and then in getting rid of him they can heap blame upon him and thereby purge their public image somehow. At least I think that's likely to be what's going on. Can he be removed? Only by the Conservative Party or by Parliament. There could be a vote of no confidence in the government in Parliament, but that's not going to happen because the Conservatives have a pretty hefty majority at the moment, and whatever else might be going on, they don't want to be out of power. Conservatives within the party can remove him as leader. This is a rather tortuous process by which a certain critical mass of MPs need to send letters saying that they have no confidence in the Prime Minister to a committee called the 1922 Committee, and if they get enough letters, then there's a leadership election within the Conservative Party which could remove him. This is too much details to go into here, it's all very archaic. Now, there is a by-election coming up, there are local elections coming up. If the Conservative Party is essentially wiped out in these local elections, that might create enough impetus to get rid of him, but otherwise it just seems not. So if you see Brits like me consumed with impotent rage at the uselessness of our politics and the fact that the man hasn't had the decency to resign, because convention and decency is what a lot of British politics runs on, and yet it's in short supply. Yeah, that's why we're so angry and impotent and full of rage. It's because there's just no way to force the issue. Zang. There are certain kinds of people, ale-drinking people, people who did a little too much acid in the 60s, people who wear large warm jumpers and take long brisk walks in the countryside. These people maintain that fairies not only exist, but that they are very common. They also tend to believe that fairies are a countryside phenomenon, much like casual cruelty to animals, sexual intercourse with sheep, and having an impenetrable and parochial accent. This is, of course, rather wide of the mark. Fairies have always had a strong relationship with man, darning his socks, cobbling his shoes, cleaning his houses, drowning him, marrying him, and swapping his children for malformed hydrocephalics as a bit of a jape, and otherwise aiding or demeaning the efforts of man. Fairies do not need our belief to exist, they need us and the things that we leave around. Like an urban fox or the aerial rat known as the pigeon, if they survive, they will have adapted to city life and found their niches, not in tending to flowers and trees, but in crashing computers, letting down the tyres on people's cars, and eating leftover pizza. Urban Fairy is a game of those kind of fairies, gone feral and urban, adapted to modern life. It's a comedy game of hijinks, weirdness, and strangeness, and it almost runs itself. You want Urban Fairy Pocket Edition, which is revised and updated with better art and edited writing, and it's available from post-mort.com, DriveThruRPG, and lulu.com.